Hi, Bush. Today's lecture is over one of the greatest stains in human history, the enslavement of people based on the color of their skin. 250 years of slavery led to 90 years of Jim Crow, which, as Ta-Nehisi Coates argues, created the conditions for racist financial and housing policies that seek to keep a permanent underclass of disenfranchised Americans who are easily identified by their race. Until we, as a society, reckon with the legacy of slavery, we will, as Coates says, never be whole. With that said, let's go back to the early 19th century. By the 19th century, cotton was king. This, of course, was thanks to the cotton gin and the burgeoning Industrial Revolution. Looking at this map, you can see that the highest concentration of slaves was in cash crop producing areas of the Deep South, along the cotton producing Mississippi Delta, the tobacco producing Virginia and Maryland Tidewater region, and, of course, the rice plantations of South Carolina. The market revolution led to exponential increases in slavery, as this chart shows, and as the demand for cotton rose, also increasing by over 700% by 1860. Despite the profitability of slave labor, the normal image of sprawling plantations with massive slave populations was not the norm. The vast majority of slave owners had between only 1 and 5 slaves, as the map indicates. And again, you can see this syncs up with the previous map in terms of sort of distribution. So these small families, who are they? They were called yeoman farmers. This is a term that you should know. Yeoman farmers had every reason to resent slavery because slave labor predominantly enriched the wealthy planter class that had social and political power and superiority. So why did yeoman farmers, most of whom owned no slaves, support slavery? Because a race-based labor categorization elevated them on the social pyramid. The wealthy Southern elite stoked this fire by finding biological, biblical, and social reasons blacks should remain in bondage, and despite the fact that many were desperately poor and illiterate, it provided and reinforced a personal and economic identity. By the time of the Civil War, slaves were the most valuable commodity in the entire country, and the Second Middle Passage transported slaves to the Deep South, usually ripping them away from their families. Right? You'll recall the First Middle Passage was the trip from Africa upon slave ships over to the Caribbean and also the east coast of America. Second Middle Passage, right, as we're expanding westward, market revolution, slaves are moving to the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, etc. Given such a heinous institution, how was it justified? Well, prior to 1830, slavery was considered a necessary evil. Many of the founders had slaves, and several, including Jefferson, recognized the problems it would eventually create. Jefferson said, quote, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is on one scale, and self-preservation on the other." Essentially, and ironically, Jefferson felt that what the Republic stood for, which is liberty, was so important that the economic possibilities offered by cash crops were necessary to maintain so as to preserve the nascent country. He recognized the inconsistencies, and history has in some ways judged him harshly for this. Post-1830, however, race-based slavery was so entrenched in the South that Southerners had to find other ways to defend it so as to maintain its existence into perpetuity. Southerners such as John C. Calhoun, who you'll recall was vice president under Jackson, also served some other positions as well in the cabinet. John C. Calhoun argued that slavery was not a necessary evil, but in fact a positive good. This theory posited that slaves were biologically inferior and thus the beneficiaries of white benevolence and paternalism, also known as the paternalistic ethos. Oops, sorry about that. So this is known as the paternalistic ethos. One of these justifications is also the religious justification. Right? Many masters used Christianity to maintain social control as well as to justify the institution. Generally, however, they focused much more on the Old Testament, fire and brimstone, rather than the New Testament, love your neighbor stuff. One such foundation was the story of the curse of Ham. Despite being a very poor interpretation of the Bible, masters claimed that the Bible separated the races and that the blacks were inferior before God. as this revelation of Aunt Catherine Emmerich, who was a Catholic sort of interpreter of the Bible in the 19th century. She says, quote, "I saw the curse pronounced by Noah upon Ham moving toward the ladder like a black cloud and obscuring him. His skin lost its whiteness. He grew darker. I saw a most corrupt race descend from Ham and sink deeper and deeper into darkness. I see the black, idolatrous, stupid nations are the descendants of Ham. Their colors due not to the rays of the sun, but to the dark source whence those degraded races sprang." Masters also used Christianity to justify and encourage submission, again maintaining social control, right here from the Bible in the book of Ephesians. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ." From a historical perspective, justification came from looking at the Greeks and the Romans, right? Founders looked back to the Greeks and the Romans as an example for republicanism and intellectual development. So too did slave owners look back to the classical period to justify slavery. And yes, the Greeks and Romans had slaves, and yes, that's a bad thing, but there is no comparison, to be clear, between the practice of enslaving prisoners of war with the potential to buy one's freedom and the 19th century practice of chattel slavery, which turned humans into property and did so on the basis of race. Chattel slavery is a term that you should know, and it's the idea that slaves are property, and this condition is permanent and it is inheritable by offspring. The social justification of slavery, one example of this, right, is the mudsill theory. So similar to Southern paternalism, George Fitzhugh popularized the social theory known as the mudsill theory. He argued that slaves had it better than northern factory workers because they were taken care of, and that they actually enjoyed slavery because it was in their nature to be servile. So we're going to look at two cartoons here. It's actually really part of one cartoon, but it's in two halves. This is titled "Slavery as it Exists in America," and obviously you can't read what the individuals in the background are saying. But in this scene, Southern slaves dance and play as four gentlemen, two Northerners and two Southerners, observe. Says one of the Northerners, "Is it possible that we of the North have been so deceived by false reports?" The Southerner replies, "It is, as a general thing, some few exceptions. After mine have done a certain amount of labor, which they finish by 4 or 5 p.m., I allow them to enjoy themselves in a reasonable way." And obviously this is an anti-abolitionist point of view, and you can see that this person portrayed slaves as singing and dancing and having a grand old time. This was then juxtaposed against slavery as it exists in England. The second scene takes place outside a British textile factory. At left, a well-dressed gentleman encounters a ragged, stooped figure and asks, "Why, my dear friend, how is it that you look so old? You know we were playmates when boys." The stooped figure responds, "Ah, farmer, we operatives are fast men, and generally die of old age at 40. Behind them and to the right, an emaciated mother laments over her ragged children. "Oh dear, what wretched slaves this factory life makes of me and my children." Nearby stands a fat cleric, holding a book of tithes, and an equally fat official holding taxes. In the right foreground, two barefoot youths converse. The first says, "I say, Bill, I am going to run away from the factory and go to the coal mines, or at least I only have to work 14 hours a day instead of 17 as you do here." The second responds, "Oh, how I would like to have such a comfortable place." So again, right, these two, this was all one large cartoon, kind of juxtaposing these two images, and the intention was to show that actually, on this paternalistic ethos, slaves are happy, slaves have it good, they're taken care of, where in the factories, these are wage slaves, men that live short lives that are brutal and full of hard work. So to be clear, though, all these rationalizations were really just a way to justify the naked greed of American commerce. Cotton shippers overseas made northern merchants rich. Northern bankers financed the purchase of land for plantations. Northern insurance companies insured slaves. And northern manufacturers sold cotton textiles back to the South. So the North was just as complicit in the practice of slavery as the South, even without owning slaves. This image here also is from the port of New Orleans, where you can see cotton bales far as the eye can see, and cotton, of course, being the impetus that led to the increase in number of slaves. You can see cotton production here increased exponentially, as previously mentioned, and the slave population increases alongside it. With the justifications addressed now and the economic motivations analyzed, let's take a look at what slave life was actually like. Really, slave life is defined by work. Anything else a slave did or was allowed to do was secondary to the primary objective, which was to produce more and more. Most work was done in the field, and while men were more numerous, both sexes found themselves picking cotton. Labor was sun up to sundown, and unlike on sugar plantations, cotton plantations, the cotton grew short enough that an overseer could supervise large numbers of slaves at once. Also, sometimes slaves would be directed by a slave driver, which was a slave himself usually that would be in charge of watching other slaves. The task system, as you'll recall, provided slaves with slightly more autonomy in the Carolinas, but rice plantation work was just as, if not more, brutal than cotton picking. In terms of harvesting cotton, plantation work wasn't just the picking of cotton. There was the picking, the de-seeding, the baling, transporting, pressing. All of this was part of the labor that exists, again, from sunup to sundown. The lives of enslaved people were just as brutal. Outside of labor, enslaved African Americans suffered many other indignities and degradations. Women could expect sexual assault on a regular basis. The plantation mistress was often aware of this, but Southern gender expectations required women to remain passive. In addition to male slave masters working out their sexual desires at the expense of their slaves, racial aggression also manifested itself through frequent beatings, whippings, and other physical violence toward both male and female slaves. This could occur for perceived insubordination or even as a preventative measure to reinforce control. The brutality cannot be overstated. A former slave recounted the death of her father in the following way. Quote, "My papa was strong. He never had a licking in his life. He helped the master, but one day the master says, 'Si, you gotta have a whooping.' My papa says, 'I never had a whooping, and you can't whoop me.' And the master said, 'But I can kill you,' and he shot my papa down. My mama took him into the cabin and put him on a pallet. He died." Slaves could also be bought and sold by their owners at will, often separating families and leading to heart-wrenching separations. And you can see here in the scene, right, slaves are being sold. Slave life also prevented slaves from any legal protections. Slaves could not testify against whites, and most laws had very loose definitions of when a slave master could kill a slave. Granted, it wasn't in their best financial interest to do so, but it still occurred fairly frequently. Literacy was also a concern. A slave that could understand how to read and write could learn about a life apart from slavery and cause trouble. It's no coincidence that most slave rebellions are caused by literate slaves, including Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. For slavery to work, slaves had to be completely dehumanized to rationalize what masters were doing. Literate slaves might learn about abolition efforts in the North or, God forbid, the idea of American liberty. So, in the face of such degrading and dehumanizing treatment, how did slaves go on? Family and religion were sources of comfort and refuge for slaves. Religion was important, but masters wanted to control access to it. A literate slave might read all parts of the Bible, not just the parts that reinforce slavery. Stories of oppressed people finding liberation with the help of a compassionate God were sources of inspiration despite the daily degradation and toil. Slaves also found solace in the story of Christ, who would one day come back for those who were downtrodden but faithful. And you can see here a slave preacher is conducting a funeral service. And if you look there in the bottom left, you can see, you should note there's the white overseer. So oftentimes slave services were supervised by overseers or masters to make sure that slaves weren't plotting against the plantation. Despite all these inequities, slaves resisted in numerous ways, including religion, escape, work slowdowns, sabotage, as well as armed rebellion. Let's talk about escape. Escape seems the logical decision for any enslaved person, but understand the sacrifice that would take. Escaping might mean you leave a spouse or children, or at the very least, those who had suffered alongside you. There was also great risk involved, and often feelings of guilt for making it to free territory while others labored down south. The route for escape was the Underground Railroad, which, just to be clear, was not a real railroad. I find myself having to clarify that more often than I would think. The railroad is not a single route, but many routes into several free states. As mentioned earlier, families were often ripped apart as slaves were sold, quote, down the river to the deep south. This also complicated escape, as most slaves knew their best chance of ever escaping was in the Chesapeake, and the further south one went, the harder it was to make it north. The railroad did extend from the deep south, but the risk increased significantly. Secret messages in the form of quilt patterns aided escaping slaves. Since slaves generally couldn't read or write, remember, teaching a slave to read or write was usually illegal, codes were used to help slaves make their way to freedom. Most quilt patterns had roots in African traditions, and the patterns relayed messages to slaves as they worked their way north. Quilts would be slung over a fence or a windowsill, seemingly to air out, and they would pass on the necessary information. Since this was a common sight, it wouldn't seem suspicious to plantation owners or overseers. Messages often contained information such as map routes and the distances between safe houses. In addition to escape, some slaves decided to fight back against their oppressors through violent means. Denmark Vesey was a former slave who, through a stroke of luck, won the lottery and was able to purchase his freedom. He could not purchase the freedom of his family, however, and some claim that this fact motivated his crusade to destroy slavery. Early on, Vesey joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or the AME Church, in Charleston, which, by the way, was the site of Dylann Roof's mass shooting in Charleston about a year ago, and he began preaching just as Nat Turner would. Vesey planned a revolt by seizing Charleston's arsenals, killing the governor, and setting fire to the city. A few nervous slaves, however, leaked the plot to their masters, and Vesey and his conspirators were arrested, tortured, and hanged. In the aftermath, AME Church was burned down, and laws were passed restricting the rights of Charleston slaves, which had been somewhat liberal. Which, right here, I'd just like to say that there are those that say, oh, this was not a hate crime by Dylann Roof, mass shooting at the Charleston AME Church about a year ago. No, it was, just a disturbed individual with some mental issues. Make no mistake, the AME Church is an incredibly symbolic place to systematically execute African Americans, and I have absolutely no qualms believing that this was hateful and racially motivated. Additionally, a rebellion by Nat Turner, the most famous slave rebellion, it was in 1831, took place in Virginia. Turner was also a literate preacher, and he led a revolt in which many whites were killed. In retaliation, whites killed hundreds of African Americans, free and slave, and put down the revolt. Before this event, there had been some anti-slavery sentiment and discussion in the South, but after the revolt, fear of future uprisings, as well as the inflammatory rhetoric of Northern abolitionists, put an end to any anti-slavery talk in the South. People were afraid there could be, as it says here, a Nat Turner in any family. So it's also worth noting that none of these rebellions were ultimately successful. There was no such thing as a massive slave rebellion that freed slaves for good. Generally, it was suicide. And so, despite the appeal in thinking about violent rebellion as probably the best means for a slave to escape, they didn't happen as often because they were very rarely successful, if ever. Ultimately, slavery was a dehumanizing, degrading, and profit-seeking institution. Under these circumstances, slaves reclaimed their humanity through family, religion, and varied forms of resistance. The inability of white slave owners to completely control African Americans fostered the creation of many touchstones of black culture, and ultimately the refusal to submit to a system of race-based subjugation made slavery an untenable reality. This would ultimately lead to the Civil War. Thanks.